Today's episode is sponsored by Future State Media, experts in off-Amazon traffic for Amazon sellers. Future State Media will build you a custom-made website to deliver sales for you on Amazon. Built to grab traffic from search engines and social media, your site can be used as a secret weapon for launching products on Amazon or just to stabilize your Amazon sales. It means you can also build an email list on autopilot. Go to futurestatemedia.com for your free guide to Google SEO for Amazon sellers today.
All right, in today's episode, we are going to talk about principles related to process. And Michael's got a fantastic list of 6 process power principles. I think that's what we're calling it. That's the list. And so if you're interested in exploring how to really put together high level but simple concepts related to strategy and process, this episode's for you. You want to use these correctly and create your own recipes, I guess you could say, in your business. You want to optimize process. You want to eliminate wasteful time and effort, and you really want to streamline your business. And this is a critical effort and role for many, many e-commerce owners to sort out and think through. And so in today's episode, we're going to dig into that. All right, so Michael, you've got an anecdote to get things started on this conversation. You want to jump in and share that?
Absolutely. Well, yeah, I'm very passionate about this topic, and the more I've dug into this, like preparing for this this episode, the more I've realized that I really do love this topic. But actually, it can sound very abstract and mechanical and very unhuman. And I want to bring in a very human level. This anecdote really comes, I suppose, property of my wife, really. So my wife's been busy shopping for different things online, as everyone does during lockdown, which we're kind of still in London at the time of recording, but will be the case in the future as well. It's a very future-proof business, e-commerce, right? And she's been busy shopping for some lovely fudge, and these guys specialize that she's been buying from, just specialize in fudge, nothing else, and she's been going back to them again and again, so obviously a happy customer. And they have a very lovely family business sort of vibe on their website, and the lady who runs it's called Yara's Fudge, and she said she's been trying to make a successful batch of fudge. She had tried for the past 5 years, but it either turned into toffee, didn't set, or became gritty. As a child, she would make delicious crumbly fudge with her mother, but the technique appeared elusive. That was until the day that she left her 9-year-old daughter Melissa with strict instructions on how to finish the batch while she rushed off to collect her second daughter Dee from brownies. They returned to find the most perfect batch of fudge. "How did you do that?" she asked Melissa. "I did what you told me to," she said. So Yora says, clearly some cooks will cut corners, but you can't do that with crumbly fudge. It really is an exact science, and I learned that from my daughter. So first of all, what lovely brand positioning, like a really relatable story, but also probably true. And what I take from that for the process thing is it's a recipe. If you don't cut the corners and you follow an exact recipe, you get a consistent result. And as a result, she can now do this on a commercial basis, albeit probably pretty small, and sell stuff to my wife repeatedly. And my wife is happy with the result consistently, whereas an inconsistent way of doing things, i.e. is not process or recipe driven, was never going to work. So that's just a very at-home example of how simple and yet important a process can be.
Well, it's interesting you mention that, because this whole lockdown scenario for us has played out in that my kids are all with us at home. I have kids in their late teens and early 20s. And so just the first week into it, my wife sent him and said to the kids, or I think we kind of brainstormed ahead of time, but we said to them, this is not fair for your mother to do all of the cooking, all of the everything, shopping. And so we basically said to the kids, you're going to take turns doing dinners and learn to cook. And so this last few months has been this journey of them basically planning the meal prep and cooking. And, it's the exact same thing. When we did, for example, like Thai food or something, when my kids cooked it, I'm like, this tastes just like the restaurants. and what I realized was they were following the precise recipes that they would find on wherever, online. But when I cook, I'm like, just throw some salt in it. Just do, and I'll never do like specific measurements. And Cinnamon has recipes that she's done for a long time, so she doesn't do specific measurements, but when you do, the outcome is really, really different. And I think that's, your anecdote is right on spot on with that. Following a process really makes a huge difference.
And to your point as well, the worst person to follow a process particularly is the person who's created it, especially an entrepreneurial type, because you get arrogant and you think, I don't need to do this. I've been doing this for 20 years. And actually what you did is you worked for 5 years. You got a beautiful formula down. and then you spend 15 years ignoring it, just like Yara did, and therefore didn't
Right.
get the result. And yeah, so the other thing to say is that it ties back in with the team thing that I know is your great passion, and we talked about,
Yeah.
which is to say, have a process and then get other people to follow it. You get a better result than doing it yourself.
Let me share the six principles, but let me just mention one tiny little anecdote before I do that that follows on in the same idea. It's different than cooking. It's actually making money related, and that is I followed Jeff Walker's product launch formula process for the last 10 years. One of his, customers, I guess you could say, for that program. And when I first implemented it, we had a program we were trying to sell, and we'd sell about 19 to 20 people into it every time we launched this little, product. It's called Design Academy. And I followed his process and had over 200 people, sign up. And I know it was his system. And then in subsequent years, that was like 10 years ago. Well, in subsequent years, I've done the just throw it together from memory, kind of not follow the process type approach to it. And my outcomes are dramatically different when I don't follow his precise recipe. And I've realized that over years. And then I go back and I say, okay, clearly I didn't do it properly last time. Let me rewatch all of his videos. Let me refollow his exact process. And guess what happens? I get a huge pop. And so
Yeah.
anyway, so that's the same idea related to making money. So let me read the principles. These are your six power principles, and then let's dive into them. So the first one is review, examine everything repeatedly. Number two, start with the end in mind. Number three, stand on the shoulders of giants or those who have gone before. Number four is focus on the critical few. Number five is move levels with awareness and fluency. And number six is monitor, communicate, and correct. So let's dig into principle one together. So what does review, examine, everything, repeat? How do you do that? What does that mean? How do you break it down?
Well, I mean, the first thing I should say is review, examine everything that gets repeated. I put it very unclearly. Yeah, I think
Okay.
the first thing with apologies to Aristotle, who said, "I believe the unexamined life is not worth living." Now, I'm not that philosophical. He was a philosopher by trade, and I'm not. But the unexamined business is not worth running. Is certainly something I would dare to say because it just becomes a nightmare of inconsistency. Imagine if this lady Yarrow was still producing really inconsistent fudge, and was selling it to my wife or anybody else out there. She'd be getting a lot of refunds. Rude reviews, etc., etc. Apart from the fact that it'd be stressful, you'd have arguments with the husband or wife about why the business isn't working. So, whatever you do repeatedly is a process. It's happening as a process anyway, but if it's not documented, you stand a good chance of it being very inconsistent. We've just given three examples of that. And the other thing to say is habit is a really powerful thing because it can work for you or against you. So, examining it gives you a chance to reset your habits to make sure they serve you. So, I think it's the most fundamental thing. So my question to you then is, would you agree with this, or how, if so, how does it pan out in your business or your clients' businesses?
Oh, sure. I mean, I totally agree with the idea and sentiment. I mean, I'm sort of a visionary long-term thinker, and so I've mentioned this before. Cinnamon and I working together is she is a brilliant technician and artist, and so she'll make amazing outcomes happen that are really finely put together. And I'm the one who kind of takes the 30,000 foot view all the time. Like, well, let's stop and think about what we're doing at kind of the meta level or macro level. And so between the two, we kind of dance back and forth. But the examination of our business is something we frequently do. Just an example from yesterday. We heard a big announcement that a company we're familiar with that was a subsidiary of a large company in our industry was sold to another company. And in the sales announcement, they described this other company, and that other company started the same time we did, 2008. And in the announcement, it just described what we already knew about them, which was, they have something like 650,000 YouTube subscribers, and they've really built their business on the back of YouTube. And and we also started our business on YouTube, and I think we have 20,000 subscribers and video content, but clearly the process related to using YouTube in our business was we just took a divergent path from them, 10 years ago or more. And we didn't, we were comfortable with our path. But yesterday we were talking about it and just sort of reflecting on it. What did they do? What have we done? how did their system work? How did our system work? Are there lessons to be learned from them? And it wasn't really jealousy or any kind of envy or anything like that. It was just like just thinking about their process versus our process, because some
Mm,
of these things you can publicly see. You
yeah.
can see how people do things. So, I mean, I think every business owner needs to constantly be reflecting, what are other people doing in the industry? What's the outcome of that? How do I learn lessons from them vicariously, and modify, tweak, change the business? Just one final quote. The book that comes to my mind for this one is Elihu Goldrate. The Goal is the book, and he's the author. And his famous system, is these three questions: what to change to, and how to make the change. And that is a process for continuous improvement, really. And so I think that goes along with this idea of reviewing and examining everything that is a constant, ongoing process in your business. Yeah.
Absolutely. I just think that what you and cinema have been doing is just that reflective time that a lot of people don't take is really important. It's not going to show up in your next, month's results, but it can over time be really super powerful. I
Yeah.
really agree
So
with that.
you've gotten Seth Godin concept too that you want to. I think I've heard you mention before. What is that?
Yeah, I think it's a really super important one. I heard it on a podcast, which isn't one of his standard podcasts. So I can't really give a good reference point, but we can dig it out and put it in the show notes, which will be, of course, at theecommerceleader.com as ever. Seth Godin's such a smart thinker, but this is even for his stuff, which is really gold. This is, super gold. That's a terrible phrase, but he says basically you've got to be very, very clear if you're a freelancer or an entrepreneur. So I would say you've got to get a truthful answer and then act accordingly. So what he says is a freelancer gets paid when they work. If they don't work, they don't get
Mm,
paid. That's how you can
mhm.
identify them. Whereas an entrepreneur creates a business, and when the business is built, it generates income with or without the entrepreneur's daily input. I mean, yes, surely monthly, yearly, management style, but either way, as he says, look, I've made a living in both ways, Seth Godin said, and either way is perfectly fine. Either way can also make good money. You can have a good life and contribute fully. So you can have freelancers like lawyers, business consultants can make very good money, have fulfilling life. And I know several people in those professions who are very fulfilled and make a lot of good money. But the terrible trap, and this is why it's so important, is to believe you're an entrepreneur but act like a
Wow.
freelancer. So my massive hint to anyone is go and examine whether your business can work without you. If it can't, it's not a business yet. It's a freelance job and probably pretty unstable, which doesn't mean that you should feel bad about it as long as you're aware of the fact that you're on the process to creating a business. That is the entrepreneurial activity, in my opinion.
Hmm.
But I think it's so, so important to be aware of the difference. And to be honest, and if you've got a great freelance gig going where you work and you get paid and then you don't work, you don't, as long as you deal with it in the appropriate way, it can be a great life. It's just when you think you have a business and you have a job that things can go horribly wrong. So I think you just have to really examine that with great honesty and then decide which way you're going to go with it.
Wow. I love that. I hadn't heard that before, and it makes a ton of sense. It does clarify the idea. Yeah. So
I
I
think
love
so.
it. Love it. Yeah.
Well, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, if you come across people in your amongst your clients that are doing one and thinking they're doing the other,
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in fact, it reminds me of a conversation I had this week with a coaching client, and not to reveal any details, but a very successful e-commerce seller, a veteran business operator. And when we started our consultancy together with him, he made it very clear that his goal was to work for the next 5 years to build the business for it to be sellable. And so, this week, just this conversation we had this week, we were reflecting on that and asking the question, okay, at the end of 5 years, what exactly are you doing that someone else would have to do? And do you have someone on your team that's going to be doing that? So for example, if we had some guy in London named Michael who wanted to buy your business, and he said, well, who does the stuff? Would you be able to say, yes, every part of this business is done by someone on the team other than me, so I can therefore say see you later, goodbye, retire, and the business is fully whole? And so we talked through that, and the challenges of that. What it means is anything he does, he has to find a process uh, uh, for replacing himself. And
absolutely.
that's deep thinking. I mean, that's the hard work. And it's funny because you say to yourself, well, I like working and I want to be in my business. I don't want to take that terminal step. And when I'm ready to retire, someone else will sort that out for me. And I'll just say what, kind of what I said to him was, if you expect the person who's going to buy your business to sort out those problems, you can expect them to pay you a lot less for the business than if you have it all sorted out ahead of time. I mean, because I'm not going to pay for work that I do myself
Yeah,
to fix something. I'm going to get a discount and say, hey, I'm buying this business for a bargain price because there's a whole bunch of stuff that nobody's sorted out. And
yeah,
so I think that goes to the idea that you want to think through, have in Seth Godin's terms, have you created an entrepreneurial situation where you built a business that's fully whole,
mm,
that you own? And Michael Gerber, I think, would call that an owner. You're the owner of the business. You're not the
absolutely.
technician.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Absolutely, and that brings you very much onto the second principle, which is start with the end or begin with the end in mind, as it was put famously by Stephen Covey in the Seven
Mm,
Habits of Highly Effective People, one of the longest book titles for a successful book. So, beginning with the end in mind, the classic situation you just articulated, begin with the end in mind of it, a time scale, 5 years time, and I want to sell the business, and exactly what you just said is true. And what are your thoughts on that? You've already shared that anecdote, so what are your thoughts about how to best do that?
the biggest mistake I see people make sometimes in coaching work is, and it sounds weird, it sounds counterintuitive. They start stuff and it's almost like in their mind they expect it to not work. And therefore they've come up with another scheme or plan. And a lot of times they'll talk to me about their new scheme or plan. Like, I'm going to do this because I watched a webinar. And I'm like, well, what about your main business? Like, it's not done yet. It's not fully cooked. It's not, you've got big gaps in your current system, your current business. And I think the begin with the end in mind quote is vital for us as e-commerce sellers, because I think the question is, what will it look like if your current business that you're currently building is 10 times bigger? And would you really start a whole nother business on the side if your current business was 10 times bigger, if you had 10 times more employees, 10 times more, you know, uh, customers? I mean, and so I think the one of the counterintuitive points for us is sort of early entrepreneurs into our efforts are, don't begin with the idea that whatever you're doing is going to fail, so you have to come up with a plan B all of a sudden. Like I think that's what is happening. People come up with a plan B because they've gotten this training or they watch a new webinar or something, when plan A hasn't even been really fully envisioned. I guess I'm repeating myself, but you get the idea. I mean, I think that's the thing that a lot of us can stumble over is, are we fully envisioning a clear and vibrant future of our current business and the implications for our personal behavior related to that?
I like that. The implications of personal behaviour. Yeah. So, in other words, start by thinking: would a CEO of a £10 million company be heading to doing this in three years' time or something? I mean, that reminds me of the a couple of quotes. Thomas Watson Jr., who created IBM, said something like, the reason we grew so fast and so big is because I had it done in my mind before we started. He saw the business. Now,
Mm,
it's kind of easy to say that retrospectively, but to be fair, not many CEOs, even of the vastest companies, have said that. And I guess you could say IBM, yeah, it's not a big name now, but yeah, but that's because the guy who founded it isn't around to run it. If he were, I wonder if it
yeah.
still would be. The other thing that springs to mind is the Bruce Lee quote, which is a bit cheesy, but I'm going to say it anyway. He says, I don't fear the man who knows 10,000 moves. I fear the man who knows one move and has practiced it 10,000 times. So to
Yeah.
your point of focus, I really think you're absolutely right. That it's very easy to get distracted by shiny object syndrome. So there's, a mixture of fear and greed, shiny object syndrome, you fear
Right.
of missing out, and then fear of failure. So between those two, you can very easily get blown off track. And I think one of the purposes of a coach is to remind you what you already have in your business that's
Mhm.
valuable.
Yeah.
So yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. Really, I think that's really important.
So do you have more on this before we move on to principle three? Any other thoughts on principle two?
Yes, absolutely. A couple of things. One is to have a process for creating processes. So, if you like a general operating principles or even a constitution, Sam Carpenter and Work the System talks about this. And it may sound a bit abstract, but actually, if you start creating processes all over the shop and you're doing some and you've got some VAs doing some and maybe a business partner, you can end up with processes that have a lot of inconsistencies. And if you sort out up front, even what you're going to name them, how you're going to order them, so you can even find them, which is one of the classic sort of documentation issues, then you're going to avoid a lot of trouble. Again, to your point of how does this business look when we're doing £10 million a year? Well, or $10 million. You can't just have a few scrappily named documents. You need to have them in a very orderly way, in a very consistent way, and so
Hmm.
that's very important. And then the other
Yeah.
thing is to starting with the end in mind is one thing, like a big hairy goal, as Jim Collins puts it. But then the other thing is to set very clear quarterly priorities. So you don't just work on big goals, but you break that down to the quarter, and then you can work towards those much more easily week by week. So that's the other
That's,
thing.
yeah, I would just say that's probably been our biggest practice is monthly at a high level,
Mm.
monthly profit and loss statement reviews, and then quarterly profit and loss statement reviews. And really what we do in our business is, I think what you could describe us as is financial based operators. We're finance focused operators, not top line revenues focused, not even product focused. I think what we've over a decade or more now come to realize is process can be horrible, a huge waste of time if the ladder is leaning against the wrong wall, you know, and you build all this process, but then the hard acid test is this hitting the bottom line effectively? Is the profit in our business growing because the process in our did I say that right? Is the profit in our business growing because the process in our business is efficient and has grown well? And a lot of times we'll have process, we can eliminate whole parts of our business and think that didn't hurt us at all on the profit side of things. And so that's really how the lens we look through for this stuff, I think. Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Absolutely, yeah.
let me ask you this question. Principle number 3 is stand on the shoulders of giants. What do you mean by that? How do you do that? How does that work?
Well, I suppose I just thought it sounded like a cool phrase, but actually, what I really mean is copy existing processes, a more mundane way of putting it. But a bit like you were saying, where you were reviewing, your competitors or people in the same industry who'd done a different sort of path with their use of YouTube,
Hmm.
then yeah, copying existing processes. Sometimes you can just simply copy an existing process directly within legal and ethical limits. By the way, you may need to buy it, and there's a great tool called Flowster, run by a guy called Trent Dersmit, who I interviewed recently for the podcast, and that's really good way of doing it. For example, there's lots and lots of tools out there. There's sort of templates on Asana or Trello, what have you.
What is
Um,
Flowster? I'm not familiar with it.
yeah,
What does it do for you?
Flowster basically will kind of integrate having an SOP or a template for how you do things. They call them workflows with the whole managing people going through it, which you would typically do through Asana or Trello or whatever. So you
Hmm.
can create or copy an existing process, and they have a kind of marketplace for SOPs, which I think is really cool. And you can buy. He also sells some giant process for what do you call it, Amazon wholesale,
Okay.
where you can buy for $2,500. You can buy basically a system. So instead of buying a course on how to do it, you buy a system and then plug some VAs into it, which is kind of the next level up, I think, from running
Wow.
following a course. So yeah, I think that's a very obvious example. There are many less obvious examples around, but I think that's really important to not reinvent the wheel, because most of the time what you're doing has been done before many times and refined by somebody. So I think that's really important. So, my question then with copying or modeling processes, what are your experiences of that, and what are
Yeah.
the
Well,
dangers?
yeah, I love it. It's a shortcut for sure. I mean, it's a hugely beneficial concept to just look at the experts, copy what they're doing. Two examples come to my mind real fast. This weekend, I spent time going through some Frank Kern training on copywriting. If you're not familiar, Frank Kern is a fantastic copywriter, and he describes how he learned, which was having one monitor open with, I think it was, I forget who he was talking about as he did this, but it had a monitor open on the left, and then he would do word for word example kind of, application of the copywriting into his own business, changing, of course, everything related to the details, but the concepts, the framework. for copywriting was very, in that regard, standing on the shoulders of giants. Um, and I love that. And so I was doing that exact same thing with Frank Kern, Facebook ads copywriting concept. And so, and I literally typed it into a Word document. He was doing a PowerPoint slide on his training, and it was a training I'd signed up for. And I was just literally writing his copy in a Word document so that I can use that as my template. And I love that stuff. The other thing I noticed this weekend was good old Nathan Hirsch, our buddy who founded FreeUp. He did a Facebook post and he said, right now we're building this marketing system, and he listed like 6 things in his Facebook post, and it was so good. It was like he's building this, and then he's building this and this and this, and this is how it all works together. And I was like, dang, I'm just copying that whole list. So I literally in my phone tapped it, hit copy, went to notes and put paste, just so I could keep it, and refer back to it, and use that as sort of a guide for replicating his wise approach to that topic. So I'm
Yeah.
a huge fan of this. I try to do this as much as I can. Of course, book learning is in essence the foundation for this, but nowadays online training is so available to us. Keeping it and learning from it is vital. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I would say there's a couple of things. I mean, for modeling at the more high level, or the strategic type level, then the books can be really fantastic if they've really been thought through by somebody. But yeah, when it comes to the more tactical level stuff, I think Frank Kern is I'm a fan of his copywriting approach. He's quite a character. I mean, it's very salesy but very charismatic. So if you can bring it off, it's wonderful stuff. And then Nathan Hirsch, I agree. I mean, I know Nathan quite well. Interviewed him for the podcast. I've used his services. My clients have used his services. I mean, he is Mr. Process. He's super efficient. So definitely a good person to model for sure. I'm a big fan of his work. So, okay. Well, look, this is a huge topic. We're going to do a second bite of this cherry next episode, because we've got to finish off the next sort of 3 principles. But for today, what are your takeaways from the topics we've covered today?
Well, I think the thing that stands out to me the most is your Seth Godin quote, which is this idea of are you a freelancer doing pay for hourly gig type work, or have you built a business that can operate without you? I love that concept, and I would just challenge everybody to hit pause on your iTunes player or whatever and think about it, and really begin with the end in mind. A concept just needs to be thought through. What happens if we get hit by a bus? What happens if we want to sell our business? What happens if we're ready to be done and want to move on and or just retire and let someone else run our business and send us a check? One final anecdote I'll tell you about that Cinnamon and I laugh about together is I have a business mentor and friend who runs Dairy Queen franchises in the United States, is like Burger King or McDonald's, and he runs some for these owners. They would own the properties, and he was the operational manager, but he also owned his own franchise. And we were in his office one day, and one of the brothers, the owners, walks in, and Ron takes an envelope off of his desk, and just hands it to the guy. And the guy turns around and walks out, and they didn't even say anything to each other. And we were like, what was that? And then he said, oh, they're off to Cabo San Lucas. That was Larry, one of the owners. And that was his check I was giving him. And Cinnamon and I laughed and laughed. And she said, Cinnamon on the way home said, how do we get Iran so that we can have checks handed to us so we can go to Cabo San Lucas?
Nice.
And that was exactly what Larry and his brother had sorted out, was you have a system in place. So these are the recaps to me, is think through the end in mind and really build a business that has an effective system in place that you can benefit from. Yeah.
Beautiful. I love that anecdote. That's really funny. And it's always like real life is always funnier than anything you come up with, because it just sounds a bit like I'm just seeing that in my mind. It's like a kind of wacky film scene from the Coen Brothers movie or something. I love it. But who doesn't want that? So just to wrap up then, first of all, I hope you've been enjoying. If you're listening to this, really hope you're finding this valuable. If you are, then the usual plea applies, which is please subscribe. It's great because then you'll get much more of the same thing delivered to your inbox. And if you're liking this episode, then we are going to be unpacking all of the bigger picture frameworks that we put in. And we're not just going to leave it hanging. We're going to dig into very actionable detail. So you're going to get that delivered to your podcast player choice if you do that. And of course, if you can leave us a review, it's fantastically helpful to us, and it enables us to keep this machine going and keep running this process of creating episodes for you to enjoy. So please give us all the love you can, and we will keep producing the content that you love.